My name is David Lay. I'm a member of the organizing committee of the Graduate and Faculty Christian Forum. This group has been going, I think, since around 1988, and its objective is to create a forum where faculty, graduate students, friends can explore issues of faith, scholarship, and society in an entirely open environment that welcomes diverse viewpoints. Before I introduce Professor Brian Bird, who is speaking today, I'll just mention we usually look ahead before we enjoy the present. It's a good, I think, good Christian virtue. I just want to let people know that our next meeting is going to be on the 20th of January, when the speaker will be Dr. Paul Rowe, who is a professor at Trinity Western University, and he is giving a very interesting talk entitled "The Appeal of Caesar, the Future of Christians Living in the Authoritarian Context of the Middle East." So that's a tremendously practical issue in a very turbulent environment where there are many Christian remnants who are surviving in often very difficult circumstances. So that, I think, will be quite an intriguing and valuable presentation. Anyway, on to today. We have also a very relevant topic today, and I'm very grateful on behalf of all of us to Dr. Brian Bird, who's going to speak to the struggle for tolerance. And just a word or two about Brian, who's an assistant professor at the Allard School of Law at UBC. He's had a very interesting academic pilgrimage to this point that has included Victoria, Simon Fraser, Oxford, McGill, and most recently a postdoc at Princeton. So I think that Brian has certainly engaged a lot of diversity in those various institutions. He's published in a number of law journals and is co-editor of a book with the intriguing title, "The Forgotten Fundamental Freedoms of the Charter." And that is one of the areas of his research interest, constitutional law and theory, legal history, bills of rights. And of course, that generates some very, very practical questions. And I think that he's going to present some of that to us today, an issue which is so important, the struggle for tolerance. So thank you and welcome, Brian.
Thank you so much, Professor Lay, for the very gracious introduction, and to Gordon for the invitation to come and speak today. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope that you can all hear me well. It's really wonderful to be here. Oh, I think there might be a mic on out there. Maybe I'm the co-host. I can. I'm a bit out of practice with the Zoom class. I was a Zoom professor all of last year. I'm now in person fully, so I'm a bit out of practice. So forgive me if my Zoom kind of instincts aren't as sharp as usual. But it's a pleasure to be here, and a pleasure to speak with you today about this topic, about the struggle for tolerance. And I suppose my basic message is one that I think has to be spread at the grassroots level. It's not going to come, I mean, if politicians and if the state wants to spread it as well, that's all well and good. But I think it does have to start at the grassroots level. And it is this idea of rehabilitating what I think is a foundational aspect of a free and democratic society, of a liberal democracy, which is this idea of robust tolerance, of, as it's sometimes put, live and let live. And I think that we have lost, or in recent maybe decades, maybe in recent years, we're losing our grip on that as a society, which of course can invite or at least open space for the feared, sometimes a bit cliche, but I think it's real, the tyranny of the majority, or at least perhaps the tyranny of the intolerant minority within the majority. And so to rebut that opening, that space, I think that really the takeaway message is we have to spread the message first by living it, living tolerance towards others, with the hope that it'll be lived in response by those who are on the other side of whatever issue it might be. Now, I think that the title, "The Struggle for Tolerance," is an apt one, and I don't think it was me. I think it was Gordon who came up with it, because tolerance is by nature an uncomfortable topic, an uncomfortable sentiment, an uncomfortable posture. It comes from this idea of bearing with, or putting up with things that you probably disagree with, and maybe even more than disagree with, that you find maybe even repugnant or offensive. But there's this notion, to quote the Supreme Court of Canada in one case from 2001, they said that for better or for worse, tolerance of divergent beliefs is a hallmark of a free and democratic society. And I think that's right. If it weren't the case that we had that kind of robust tolerance, if we don't have that kind of robust tolerance, things become rather totalitarian rather quickly, perhaps sometimes in subtle ways at first, but nonetheless still totalitarian. So I just wanted to start off with, in some ways, what is also the bottom line of my talk, which is this idea that we need to take care to, first of all, make sure that we're living in a tolerant way towards others, especially those with whom we disagree. And usually tolerance only comes up when we're talking about things with which we disagree, or people with whom, more ideas with which we disagree, and conduct flowing from those ideas. But we also need to make sure that, well, how do we ensure that others live tolerance? I think part of it is indeed living it first ourselves. And perhaps we can all do work on that. I know I can. But we need to make sure that we also just simply spread the message as well, that tolerance is not there's a report that came out recently by a think tank called Cardis. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's on conscience rights, but there's some passages in there on tolerance. And it's fair to say, I think, that for one reason or another, tolerance has become a bit of a dirty word in our society. I don't know fully why, but it is. I think this idea of tolerating, putting up with things with which you disagree, especially if you're in the majority, vis-a-vis the minority, has become a dirty word. And that's really troubling, because there's no shortage, whether it's in the realms of political theory, in the realms of judicial decision-making, political statements, there's no shortage of statements and ringing endorsements of the idea of accommodating a wide variety of beliefs in a liberal democracy, of respecting minorities, respecting the minority viewpoint. As I'm going to be speaking quite often about the Supreme Court of Canada, because it's kind of my neck of the woods, so to speak, but as then Justice McLaughlin, she wasn't Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin at the time, in a case on freedom of expression, which is a protected right or freedom under the Charter, she said that, strictly speaking, the majority viewpoint doesn't really need constitutional protection, doesn't need the shield of the Constitution. Why? Well, they have strength in numbers. They have the majority. They have the power of numbers. It's really, the minority viewpoint, the threatened viewpoint, the vulnerable viewpoint that is most acutely in need of the protection of, whether it's the Constitution, and of, frankly, of tolerance. So I think we're losing a little bit of that. And there's a number of cases I can go through. I'll talk about some cases, some of which you might be familiar with, some case studies that I think reveal at its root just a notion that, and sometimes the majority or the intolerant minority within the majority is perhaps acting sincerely, in the sense it thinks that it's acting for the greater good as it sees it, but in so doing, it's acting in an intolerant way. And again, I think we have to always come back to this notion that tolerating beliefs with which we disagree, well, it happens every day. I mean, we don't even notice it sometimes. There's so many things we see on a daily basis, each and every one of us, that or interactions we have with others, or advertisements we see, or things that kind of come across our radar that we not only disagree with, we find repugnant, offensive, but we don't go and somehow enlist the power of the state or the courts every single time that happens to try to shut it down. We are first and foremost a free and democratic society, And we have a number of freedoms, fundamental freedoms, as they're called in the Charter, such as freedom of expression, thought, belief, opinion, religion, conscience, etc., that are at the bedrock of, they're not optional things, they're not kind of nice window dressing to make us feel better about the kind of country we have or society we have. They are part and parcel, foundational, fundamental to having the society we all across the board cherish. So I think it's fair to say what we've seen in recent years, seems to me, is a growing notion that in some respects, the tyranny of the majority is okay to have and pursue. Maybe they wouldn't call it tyranny, maybe they wouldn't call it something like that, but in the name of whatever, maybe progressivism, or pick your, whatever kind of movement or cause you might want to call, choose as your case study. There's been this notion that, well, it's okay to impose through the courts, through legislation, through other more powerful means, through the arms of the state more often, but even just on a day-to-day citizen-to-citizen basis. There's been more tolerance for intolerance, if I can put it that way. And I think that's very problematic. A case that comes to mind, it's an ongoing piece of litigation, concerns a church, a Catholic church in White Rock, Star of the Sea Parish, which was approached in 2019 by a LGBTQ advocacy group based in White Rock Pride Society. And this society asked to hold a Pride fundraiser at the hall of the Catholic Church, which is right next door to the church. It's a part of its property. And there's obviously religious images that clearly indicate this is a part of this Catholic parish's the property and facilities, and they use it on a day-to-day basis, and they do rent it out to the public. But in this case, they said, listen, in light of our beliefs on marriage and family, and given what the nature of this fundraiser was going to be, it wasn't the first time it had been done. There'd been one done before, the year before, and just suffice to say, it was not compatible with what this Catholic community believed with respect to marriage and family. They said, no, I'm sorry. Here are a list of other places you can go to, either in White Rock or wherever. But I'm sorry, we're not the place for this event. And next thing they knew, there was a discrimination complaint filed against them, and this is going to be heard by the courts. I don't know. I think the hearing is set maybe for next January. It's Star of the Sea Parish versus White Rock Pride Society, or the other way around. This is an example where one would hope that in a society where we cherish tolerance, and where tolerance is not a kind of a maybe optional kind of thing, as opposed to being something that's fundamental and a fundamental aspect of what it means to be a part of a free and democratic society, that what should have been done, what should have happened, frankly, this should never have been filed as a lawsuit. It should have been, okay, you believe this, clearly inconsistent with our beliefs, we move on. That would seem to me to be, for a variety of reasons, a much more constructive approach, as opposed to now taking a church to court for what I think on any, and the reason why I think ultimately this should be an easy case, should be, I hope, is if you were to flip it around. Imagine if White Rock Pride Society, for one reason or another, had its own facility, a hall some property that it had, and it opened it up to the public for renting for extra profit, but also for holding its own events, which is what the Catholic parish does. And the Catholic parish, its hall happened to be under renovation, and they wanted to have a fundraiser on traditional marriage and family and things of that sort. And if the Catholic parish went to White Rock Pride Society and said, listen, could we use your hall for this purpose, this fundraiser? Not surprisingly, I would imagine White Rock Pride Society would say, no, I'm sorry, this doesn't jive with our beliefs on these things. And that would have been the end of it. Should have been the end of it. So in other words, if the court is going to be prepared to rule in favor of White Rock Pride Society, it would have to be prepared to rule in favor the other way around. And if it's not, and I don't think it should be, that should really be the end of the case. But I think at the root of this case, it's interesting, if a different approach had been taken, if tolerance had been given more pride of place, had been higher in the kind of the ordering of priorities and principles, in this case, for example, we would not be having. And now what do we have? We have obviously litigation, which brings with it, obviously there's cost involved, there's acrimony, there's bitterness. All it does is, or it's prone to creating more divisiveness between citizens, as opposed to, yes, perhaps a bit awkward to say, no, I'm sorry, we're not going to have the event here. Let's here's some other options, and they move along. It seems to me that on a variety of levels, it's a far better approach. So that's just one case. Another one that comes to mind, unfortunately, these are all from British Columbia. Another one that comes to mind is one you might be familiar with. It's the Irene Thomas Hospice in Delta, a 10-bed hospice, which had existed from the early 90s, I believe, forgive my chronology. But once assisted death, once euthanasia became legalized in Canada, pressure mounted on this private hospice society and private hospice, private facility, which is licensed by the government to provide hospice care, end-of-life care, to add to its repertoire euthanasia. And for a variety of reasons, it was clear from the founders' kind of viewpoint, the mission statement, the worldview that kind of animated this hospice, that wasn't part of what they believed constituted good end-of-life care. They just morally, conscientiously disagreed with euthanasia. And instead of a 10-bed hospice, which for years had provided, no one has ever questioned the quality of the care that is provided to people, to citizens, it was effectively forced to shut down. It lost its license to operate, even when it had actually, and this really goes to show the level of intolerance that was at play in this case, even when the private hospice society said, listen, we would be happy to forego receiving any government funds. You don't have to pay us anything. You don't have to subsidize us any, just take that away, take the funding aspect away. I don't think that should have to be done, but take that away. We'll just operate totally, completely, utterly privately, and continue to provide the care that so the taxpayers aren't giving us anything. Let's continue that way. The government said, nope, you have to provide euthanasia or shut down, and that's what's happened. There's been some recent kind of a bit of flurry of activity to my knowledge on that front. I don't know all of the details of what's going on there, but the fact that it even came to that, where earlier this year, this hospice had to basically vacate its premises, or vacate, and it was taken over by I think Fraser Health, I imagine it would be, just goes to show. And again, when you really dig down and think a bit more about a case like that, here we have, surely, given that there are a variety of opinions out there on whether euthanasia is okay or not, it's not surprising that there are many people, individuals, patients, citizens who might want to be in a facility which they know, when their families know, euthanasia is an absolute red line, not going to happen. And yet we have had a facility like that up until the Delta Hospice Society. The Irene Thomas Hospice was forced to, given an ultimatum, either provide euthanasia or you're going to be shut down. So tolerance also, where it is practiced, can support some of the things that we hear, with all due respect, many politicians and many other people talking about all the time: diversity and inclusion, things like this. Well, if we like genuine diversity and inclusion, it seems to me one of the ways to do that is to, in a case like this, for example, is to ensure that we have certain facilities which the patients and their families know will not be a place, not be a site where euthanasia is practiced, if they're more comfortable with that. So interestingly, whereas I'm sure you would see words like diversity and inclusion used somehow against the hospice, it seems to me that where tolerance is practiced in this case, if it had been practiced in this case, we actually would have seen those principles that are so lauded by many be actually truly cultivated and enriched. And that hasn't happened. Where tolerance is replaced by intolerance, indeed, what we have is truly a tendency towards a bit more of a totalitarian state of affairs, in which you must conform to X standard, belief, principle, worldview, or get out of town, so to speak, or kind of be ostracized or retreat to the periphery. Now, all of that being said, there's no question that tolerance is not kind of an unlimited principle. It has its limits. In other words, there is a point at which we would say, no, we don't have to tolerate certain conduct flowing from certain beliefs. And there are some very basic kind of fundamental principles or red lines, if I can put it that way, where we'd say, okay, no, we don't have to tolerate that. Obviously, where someone's conduct or beliefs involves violence or tangible harm or the clear trampling of the rights of others, absolutely. that's a situation where those are situations where for a long time it's not controversial. We would say, okay, no. That's where we can say tolerance has its limits. But it seems to me that in these cases and in many others, and with an increasing rate or frequency, we're seeing an erosion of tolerance in the name of things like, I would say, kind of impoverished ideas of diversity and inclusion. In some cases, doing things in those names, in the name of those principles that actually cut against diversity and inclusion. Also, progressivism just writ large. I know there's a lot in there as to what that means, and it can feel okay or good or somehow principled to say, well, listen, yeah, sure, we're telling others how they must live, or they're saying you must do this, or kind of get out of the public square, but we're doing it in the name of progressivism, and that's a good thing. Well, it seems to me that part of our liberal democratic order, our free and democratic society, is that we give quite a bit of space for individuals to try to figure out what the good is and then to pursue it. We are generally reluctant to impose beyond these kind of basic commitments to protect human dignity, safeguard people from violence, et cetera, property, things like this. Beyond this kind of basic core set of civil commitments, we're not going to be too quick beyond that core to get involved with what someone believes the good entails. That balance and drawing that line and where that line gets crossed and not crossed is incredibly difficult. It's like the work of, it's the work of hundreds of, maybe a millennia of kind of political theory and philosophy. But the basic point is, in a liberal democracy, in a free and democratic society, I would say we err more on the side of making room for diversity, actual diversity in the public square, rather than cutting it off. Of course, there are those red lines where we'll say, nope, tolerance is not needed here because of whether it's clearly an evil act or harmful or destructive, et cetera, et cetera. But so when people say, oh, no, well, we're doing this for a good reason, we're being intolerant, they may not say that word, but we're doing what we're doing, we're requiring conformity to some sort of standard or principle or belief because it's for the sake of progressivism or whatever it might be, that seems to me that can't be enough. That seems to be a way to kind of short circuit the debate instead of having an actual discussion. And it seems too simplistic, frankly, for what is indeed a very kind of messy but important process of going through what does tolerance require and not require. Just saying, oh no, this is out of line with what today the majority thinks is progressive it seems to me to be and correct and right. Seems to be not enough. And indeed, this is the thing. Today, what seems to be good and true to the majority, or as again, I'll say the intolerant minority within the majority, it seems to me that what happens today, what they think today is all well and good. Well, they could quite well tomorrow, and things do seem to be moving pretty fast sometimes, could well tomorrow be on the other side of the coin, which is why, another reason why it's so important to cultivate a very strong kind of bulwark of tolerance, because you can find yourself in the majority today in that kind of comfortable position of having that strength in numbers. But it's interesting to me that I can point to examples of people who even 5, 6, 7 years ago found themselves in that comfortable position on whatever kind of hot button issue it might be, now find themselves maybe on the border, if not on the let's call it the minority, non-progressive, or whatever word you want to use, side of that issue. So if we abandon intolerance, if we erode it too much, you can see how it could be an invitation to anarchy. Might be a strong word, but at the very least, a lot of kind of chaos and disorder. Today you have that power, and it boils down to, frankly, just whoever has power. So I think that one thing that's very important to note, in my view, is it's important. How do we fix this? How do we try to cultivate or rehabilitate tolerance? Well, it is a struggle, as the title of our talk says, but I think there are some things that we can do tangibly to try to work on it. First of all, I think we need to talk about it more. It seems to me that for one reason or another, while we have seen a lot of talk, and for good reason, on topics like dignity, which is very important. I think that we should continue to talk about that a lot. Freedom, rights, you can pick other words that just seem to kind of get a lot of airtime. To my mind, tolerance has maybe part of the reason why it's eroded a bit or a lot is because it's been kind of put on the back burner. Even as I was preparing for this talk, I went on to legal search engine, and not that the courts have all of the answers, but the point is just to see how often has tolerance, that word, even come up in my field, constitutional law, dealing with our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is kind of in the Constitution more generally. Not all that often. It comes up in other forms. It is an unwritten, but totally valid and concrete principle of our Constitution that we respect the views of minorities. That is, there are a few unwritten fundamental constitutional principles that order our Constitution, things that you won't actually find the word in the Constitution, in the text of the Constitution, but it is still just as much a part of our Constitution. Those are things like federalism, democracy. Those words don't really appear anywhere in the Constitution, but they are kind of like a glue. Those ideas, democracy, federalism, constitutionalism, rule of law, these things are glue that hold together, not just the Constitution, well, but if they're holding together the Constitution, they're probably holding together in many ways, many aspects of our social order. But another one that the Supreme Court of Canada has not been shy about is saying respect for minorities. Respect for minorities. And that's often where tolerance needs to be practiced the most. It's where you have that kind of pesky, from the view of the majority, that pesky, ill-informed minority group that doesn't seem to get it. I'm being a bit facetious here, but just it's kind of, and if it wasn't for that notion that, no, we have to tolerate up to a certain level, we have to tolerate that view, even though it kind of irks me to do so. If we didn't have that, we'd be fair game to say, we're imposing the majority view upon you. So even though tolerance, the actual word, doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution, it has been extracted quite unabashedly and unambiguously by the Supreme Court of Canada and by many other scholars. It hasn't gotten enough airtime, I think, but it is there. I mentioned it being an unwritten principle via this idea of respect for minorities. It also, in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the very first provision of the Charter says that all Charter rights and freedoms are subject to limits. They're not absolute. They're subject to reasonable limits that can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. It's that final phrase, which actually I'm trying to do a bit of work on. What is a free and democratic society? What are the core ingredients of a free and democratic society? That phrase has been rarely interpreted by the Supreme Court of Canada, even though it is, as the court once said, the ultimate standard, the final standard against which any proposed limit on a charter right or freedom has to be measured against. And interestingly, on one of the very few occasions where the Supreme Court of Canada has taken the opportunity to unpack a bit in like a paragraph what constitutes or what makes up a free and democratic society, like the key ingredients. One of the things they said, and again, it's like 4 lines, but one of the ingredients was this idea of accommodating a wide variety of beliefs. It seems to me that that's tolerance in a certain, without using the word tolerance, this idea of making a lot of room for, in the public square, for not just beliefs that you disagree with, but conduct flowing from those beliefs. The Supreme Court of Canada, unfortunately, did a bit of damage to the idea of tolerance in the first litigation concerning Trinity Western University in 2001 concerning its education program. The case ultimately went in Trinity Western's favor, but unfortunately, the court mentioned that in the course of getting along the way in its judgment of getting to that final outcome, the court said that generally speaking, when you have a clash of rights or a clash of ideologies or a clash of worldviews, the general way to deal with these things is to say that there's much more room for belief than there is for conduct. And so the court then went on to say at the end of that paragraph that a phrase that I used earlier in this presentation, saying that tolerance of divergent beliefs, not conduct, beliefs, is the hallmark of a free and democratic society. Now, that notion that there's much more room for beliefs than for conduct seems to me to be, again, an impoverished view of tolerance, because as we all know, anyone can say, whether you're religious or not, that your fundamental convictions, your fundamental beliefs, the ones that really matter to you in terms of how the world is ordered, good, right, wrong, evil, bad, etc. They don't just, sure, they start as beliefs of convictions, but those convictions more often than not dictate certain conduct and certain actions or omissions. And so for the court to say, oh, there's a lot of room for belief, or there's a lot of tolerance that needs to be shown towards divergent beliefs, but impliedly not as much tolerance needs to be shown when it comes to divergent conduct or I think I should act this way, you think you should act this way, and they clash. That seems to me to be problematic. And if nothing else, just I don't know how you can neatly separate when it comes to fundamental convictions, conscientious convictions, religious convictions, to say that, oh, I can just kind of carve off the conduct and just deal with the belief. So there's a lot of work that has to be done, I think, to rehabilitate conscience, whether it's on just the citizen to citizen level, thinking of that Star of the Sea case, where in my opinion, that should have been a non-issue, in the sense that, okay, we're not going to have it here for reasons that are sensible. Even if I disagree with you, Star of the Sea parish, even if I think your beliefs are wildly off, even harmful, et cetera, fair enough. You don't feel that this is the place where we can hold your event because you'll be in contradiction of those beliefs. I'll move on. So citizen to citizen, we have a lot of work to do. The courts also have some work to do. There are some good decisions of the Supreme Court of Canada, I would say, on this front, where tolerance has seemed to, without using that word, but the kind of spirit of tolerance has been put out there. The court hasn't been shy to say that. Indeed, I think it was in the context of religious tolerance. Justice Abella once said that basically robust tolerance. She was talking about religious tolerance at that time, but I think we could extract it to tolerance more generally. She described it, I think, as a foundational aspect of an enlightened democracy. So those are good things to see. And we need to now download those principles, so to speak, and have them live and breathe at the level. The courts can say what they say. Obviously, the decisions they make that uphold tolerance, that help a lot in terms of sending a very clear message. But there's still a lot that can be done by virtue of how we behave and how others behave towards us. Now, of course, that's going to take goodwill. And so we need to educate ourselves and others that tolerance is not a dirty word. It may be a difficult topic and a difficult thing to live out, but it's always going to be worthwhile struggling for, because it seems to me that the opposite, just kind of letting go of the rope and letting intolerance take over, is far more destructive. I'll just finish off by this talk. I'd be happy to take questions and have just more discussion, to quote from the BC Court of Appeal in its decision concerning Trinity Western University's proposed law school that ultimately, when the case got to the Supreme Court of Canada, was rejected. But this is basically the final paragraph of the BC Court of Appeal's decision. And it really was a lot of tolerance at work in this decision. The court said, a society that does not admit of and accommodate differences cannot be a free and democratic society, one in which its citizens are free to think, to disagree, to debate, and to challenge the accepted view without fear of reprisal. This case, Trinity Western Law School case, demonstrates that a well-intentioned majority, acting in the name of tolerance and liberalism, can, if unchecked, impose its view on the minority in a manner that is in and of itself intolerant and illiberal. So I'll end there. Thank you so much for your attention, and happy to take questions and to go in whatever direction you'd like. Thanks. Okay, Rudy. Mr. Krause.
Thank you very much for a very important, dealing with a very important topic. I think not so much now, but in the recent past, tolerance has sometimes slipped into indifference. That I'll let you be who you are, but I don't really care about you. And I think that kind of indifference is also corrosive to a healthy community, a healthy society. What we have now, more the intolerance that becomes very adversarial. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm thinking more on an interpersonal level, but I think it has application in a wider sense too. I think as a member of a community, as a member of this society, I always strive to, as much as possible, be for the other person, have that as my baseline. And if I can be for the other person, if I want the best for the other person, rather than be against, it's much easier to be tolerant and not slip into indifference.
That's very, very helpful, Rudy. Thank you that's a very good point, that if we lean too much on tolerance or put too much weight on it or invest too much in it, or you're right. I think we can start to not be neighbors so much as just kind of, islands, kind of atomized islands where you do your thing, I do my thing, and even if what you do somehow offends me, that's okay. You just stay over there, I'll stay over here. We just, even as I was talking about the Star of the Sea example, it's like, okay, move along kind of idea. And there's some good reason for that, but at the same time, we don't want to lose a sense of being in a civil society, being co-citizens. So I think that's very, and I think maybe, it's become so, to my mind, things are very, we talk about the culture wars and people being on, battlefronts on whatever issue. I think a lot of that language, maybe I even used it in my presentation, the arms need to be laid down as much as possible. We need to get out of this concept of the culture wars of, destroying our enemies, so to speak, in terms of rhetorically or whatever it might be in court, because that's indeed, I think, corrosive. The more we start to view people as kind of a tribal, I'm on this team, you're on this team kind of way, and we're just inherently enemies, and I'll tolerate you a little bit, but there are going to be times where I'm going to come get you one way or the other. I agree with you. I think it's very corrosive. So you're right. Tolerance is important. We also don't want to get to a point where we don't view each other as fellow human beings, each with dignity and as co-citizens, and as, frankly, if I can be, as brothers and sisters at its root. So thank you for that. That's very helpful. It's a good reminder for me. Mr. Lakhani.
Yes, a few points to make. The first thing is that I think that the society that we're living in today is very different to the societies that we probably grew up in, certainly 15, 20 years ago. We're living in times that are really normalizing the abnormal. We're not talking about things like, for example, cancel culture. There are things that we can't talk about. I remember when the Obergefell decision came down in the same-sex marriage case in SCOTUS in the US. And I read those decisions very carefully, and there was one in particular from Justice Alito, and I just called it up while you were talking. You probably know what I'm going to quote. The quote is this: "I assume that those who cling to old beliefs will be able to whisper their thoughts in the recesses of their homes, but if they repeat those views in public, they will risk being labeled as bigots and treated as such by governments, employers, and schools." End quote. Now, what we've been seeing with cancel culture is precisely the tyranny of the minority over the majority. And while both forms of tyranny, the majority over the minority and the minority over the majority, are wrong, one of the problems that has arisen is that increasingly we're losing a metaphysical planimetric view of life. We are losing a sense of appreciation of hierarchy. And we've also lost the etymological sense of what the term right means, because it comes from the Sanskrit, riti. And to claim a right, or to say something is right, or even to perform a ritual, all these terms are related, means that we are acknowledging that something needs to be done in order to restore order or harmony. And going back to Felix's point that you commented about, that what is the tripping line over here, as I think you put it. You used the term dignity, and the term dignity really takes us to a metaphysical realm, which we're ignoring in society. I think that this goes beyond just the question that you have posed about tolerance or intolerance. I mean, one could give other examples. Governments play a role in all of this. The Bill 21 issue in Quebec is an example of this. And culture certainly plays a role, and increasingly so. But I think that what lies at the heart of this is more than just tolerance and metaphysical questions about what it means to be a human being. there is an inscription at the United Nations taken from a Persian poet, Saadi, Saadi of Shiraz. It's the famous Beni Adam verse, where he says, I'm paraphrasing here, that the children of Adam are as limbs to each other. And if a person cannot empathize with another, feel the pain of another, that person is not worthy of being called a human being. So this is a question about what it means to be human, what it means to have dignity. These are, the root questions are metaphysical. So I'll just offer that as a point of view.
Well, thank you so much. I 100% agree with you that definitely goes far deeper than tolerance. And I think you're actually, as I was listening to your comments, I think what you said at the end links a bit to the beginning with this idea of cancel culture, because you're right that at the end of the day, the most fundamental questions are these questions of what does it mean to be human? What is human dignity? What counts as human flourishing? What leads to human flourishing? And yet, what we're seeing a lot of today is suppression of even discussion of that topic. You talk about cancel culture, just certain views not being allowed to be even expressed, not being tolerated in the public square. You can talk about them as much as you want at home, quoting Justice Alito, so to speak, at home, in private, but if you want to write an op-ed on it, or you want to speak about it in a lecture, or if you want to speak about it in public in some way, not allowed. And so it's interesting that in some ways I agree with you. I do agree with you completely that the core questions are, what does it even mean to be human? What is dignity? What is human flourishing? What does that look like? What's the good? These are the fundamental perennial questions but if we're not even allowed to, or if we're being increasingly disallowed from having open, frank discussion of those, and we're just increasingly only allowed to hold these views in our heads, or just speak about them privately, kind of in a hushed way at home, indeed, we're just not going to get anywhere. And indeed, our understanding of these topics will be increasingly impoverished. And that, to your point, that just leads us in a very, very dark direction. I see without meaning to be, I don't want to be overly pessimistic, but I agree with you, Mr. McCartney, that the fundamental questions are the ones which are indeed more fundamental than tolerance. Although I think the more that tolerance is stifled, especially in the area of expression, freedom of speech, for a long time, freedom of speech, tolerating pretty much everything in the context of speech, not everything, but pretty close to everything, was seen as being at the heart of a liberal democracy, or very much at the heart of a liberal democracy, having this open exchange, the so-called marketplace of ideas. And it seems to me that part of that was so that we could have these very important consequential discussions on things like human dignity and human flourishing. And to the extent that those conversations are happening less and less, or they're being overtaken by certain people with power, dictating what the answer is in a very kind of in a way that doesn't have a lot of pre-existing discussion or discussion beforehand, you can see how, to your point, it becomes a bit of a tangle of issues that work in a disturbing way together. So I appreciate that comment very much. I really appreciate you putting that on my radar. Thank you. Gordon, I saw your camera came on. I don't know if that was you warming up for a question. But yes, David has one too, perhaps.
Yes. Well, I just just to follow through with what you're talking about, I think I found the work of Emmanuel Levinas quite helpful on the idea that we have a responsibility for the other. And he was a Holocaust survivor and a Parisian philosopher, but he was one of the Parisian philosophers that really believed in putting some limits on autonomy, so that you would be, to build a society, you had to take responsibility. There was responsibility in the face of the other. And I think that, sorry, that adds a little bit to this discussion, just that idea that we would sense a stronger responsibility to make a better society. So I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah, no, I think it builds a little bit on this idea that Rudy was talking about of if tolerance being too pumped up, so to speak, or if it gets too much space, or he's given too much airtime, so to speak, we might start to become quite atomized and just, okay, I'll deal with me, you deal with you, and it's sort of civil society working together towards a common goal, towards the common good, somehow kind of fades out of view, it seems, or is more prone to fading out of view because we're just worried about determining the level at which the line is tripped, at which point I can no longer need to tolerate the stuff that you do that I don't agree with. It's all about, what do I think? What do you think? What do we disagree on? And let's see where that trip line is. So I agree. I think, though I think that what we're seeing in society more and more is where there's perhaps too much intolerance, if nothing else, that also breeds a lot of animosity. To my mind, cultivates a lot of animosity that can create a bit of a snowball effect in a really bad direction. But I agree with you, both of you, and I think you're kind of in a way echoing, if I understood you correctly, Gordon, I think you're echoing Rudy in a certain respect, that we don't want to become indifferent. We want to look out for the other. But I suppose at some point, or in some respect, tolerance is meant to be a way to respect, I guess, the dignity of the other, in the sense of allowing them to, if what they're doing, let's say, Star of the Sea, for example, the Catholic Church is, standing on its religious beliefs or its conscientious beliefs, respecting, if we view that being one of the fundamental freedoms in the Charter, and that's no accident, because we would say that it points to human dignity, tolerating that viewpoint, tolerating even action that flows from conduct that flows from that viewpoint, is a way to, at some level, even though it kind of in the moment makes us kind of queasy, affirm the dignity of the other. So there's a lot of tensions there, it feels like, and ones I still have to work out quite a lot. But I agree with this general point that's been made both by you and Rudy, that we can't let tolerance kind of turn into indifference, or unduly give rise to more indifference. I think that would be very unfortunate for building a society in which we live together in terms of having a common life together. And David, I think you had a question, and perhaps Barry.
This is about the university. The university, of course, is a treasured institution of liberal democracy. It is where we expect to see the very best tenets of openness to diverse viewpoints. And yet, as we know, the university has become one of the real venues of cancel culture, both in terms of dismissing the right of people to speak, but also, I think, far more insidiously than that, by taking precisely the kind of tribal perspective that you mentioned, that where in the classroom, certain points of view are simply ignored. So that there's this is not a violent or vigorous cancelling, it is simply an insidious cancelling of a perspective which the speaker disagrees with, and let me say, the professor disagrees with. What do you make of this? It seems to be such a contradiction of the ideal of the university, which is to embrace universality. It's to embrace views from all places and all kinds. I mean, is there a sociological explanation for this? Well, what is your take on it?
Well, thank you, David. I can't help but think of my former boss, someone who I admire very much, at Princeton University, Professor Robert George, who holds the McCormick Chair in Jurisprudence and is a leading public intellectual in the United States. He gave a talk, a public lecture, while I was at Princeton, on the truth-seeking mission of the university, which he basically tries to push back on what we've seen, this trend of that mission being obscured. Universities somehow we've forgotten, it seems at some level, that at their root, universities are meant to be places of very much free exchange, perhaps one of the freest places of exchange of ideas in a liberal democracy, with the objective of trying to seek truth, knowledge, wisdom, etc. And why has it happened? I still actually, I'm a bit mystified as to why we've seen this trend. I would suppose that universities have for a long time and continue to have indeed a lot of influence on society by virtue of the ideas that are generated by scholarship, by scholars in universities. And so I suppose without meaning to sound in any way nefarious, or you could see how it could be a good place, a good venue for trying to render it a place where it becomes more akin to a think tank that has a particular kind of adopted worldview that its scholars, or an increasing number of its scholars, ascribe to and produce scholarship in and disseminate knowledge in furtherance of. So I suppose perhaps the university has been seen as an appetizing option or venue or site for these kind of more, as I said, more kind of political, as ideological, or as I said, to transform it into something else other than a university, is something more akin to a think tank or a political advocacy machine, so to speak. So that's what my best guess as to why it's happened, or why we've seen it happen. I mean, I suppose I'm sure if we were to look in history, there have been other moments where universities, maybe not widespread, but individual universities have been kind of captured to a certain extent, or elements, or maybe certain departments have been captured by kind of an adoption of a worldview that all the faculty must agree with or not be allowed to be members of that faculty. But I think it does boil down to, wow, the university has a great influence on society, and perhaps subtly, not in a very blatant way, but slowly but surely we've seen this mission, this truth-seeking mission, take a back seat for one reason or another. Indeed, even just the notion of truth, that word being stated or uttered on a campus, seems to me to become, it has in and of itself become a dirty word, that we're here to seek truth. You can hear this notion of relativism and things like that. And yet you still look at, Harvard University, what's their motto? Veritas, right? Truth. And it's not an accident. So that's my best guess right now. I also happen to mention that I mentioned Professor Robert George. He's actually going to be giving a lecture at UBC next January on the truth-seeking mission of the university. So stay tuned for that. Keep your eyes open. He's not to be missed if you can get in. I think Barry and then Mr. Lakani. I think Barry, you had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, this is probably fairly ignorant, but I'm going to throw it out anyways. On the flip side of tolerance is another principle. I've heard little bits of a scholar, John Burroughs, talking about obligations to love within treaties, within constitutions, and instead of talking about tolerance, I think what a number of people have talked about is not indifference, but the obligation to love within society. And I'm just wondering if people are taking the types of thoughts he's having seriously and trying to push them in sort of ways of thinking legally.
Is this Burroughs, as in Borrows? John Burroughs?
Right.
Yeah, he was a professor at my law school I attended at University of Victoria. Sadly, I didn't have a class with him. I think he was on leave at the time. But I'm not, sadly, and also ashamedly, I'm not very familiar with that aspect of his work, or much of his work in general. I should read more of him because he is a big thinker and a very well-respected scholar. I don't know if I've seen that flip side of tolerance described that way, but I think there's a lot to it, Barry, and a lot to think about there that sounds very fruitful to me. That, or maybe they work hand in hand. Maybe it's this idea of you tolerate things that you disagree with, but that doesn't mean that you write off the other person as being, if we disagree, therefore we can't be friends or somehow work together. And I think of, for example, I mentioned Robert George. I mentioned that he gave that lecture in Princeton that I attended, but he gave it with someone who he has given this lecture with many times. His name is Cornel West. He was another leading public intellectual in the United States who was at Harvard. I've lost track where he is now, but the two of them, Cornel West and Robert George, agree on very little politically, substantively. But one of the few things they agree on vehemently, or that they're in lockstep on, is this idea of the university being a place where truth is sought, and there needs to be a very, very, very great amount of latitude towards free expression, and basic cancel culture has no place in a university. And so my point is that they obviously, I've seen it, in the flesh, they are very clearly friends, very good friends, and they must have to tolerate at some level because they really do disagree on a lot of the kind of more political features, political topics. but they're clearly, you know, I've seen them embrace, they're very chummy. And there's many other examples. Mr. Lakhani cited Justice Alito. I'm thinking Justice Scalia, excuse me, Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg of the US Supreme Court, both late now, both have passed away, famous for being on the opposite side of pretty much every possible decision you can think of. I don't know if they ever wrote together, maybe they did, but they were famous for being very good friends. They spent every New Year's together. Their families spent New Year's together. That's correct. Very good friends, despite being kind of, not for his enemies, but definitely on the opposite side of the ledger. So I think what point I'm trying to make is I wonder if the tolerance and love can work side by side as opposed to being flipped. Maybe they can work in tandem. And maybe that's the best we can hope for in a society where, or just by virtue of our humanity, we all disagree, or not all, but there's a lot of disagreement out there on countless issues. So I'll just point to it there. Maybe the option is kind of being partners as opposed to being one or the other, if that makes sense. Maybe I'll go to Mr. Lakhani, and then David, you may have a comment.
I think we'll then need to conclude.
Okay, sure.
Because our time is just about up. So let's hear these final couple of questions, and then we'll end.
Sure, Mr. Lakhani.
Well, I'd just like to address the question that David posed about the culture in universities nowadays. I've experienced this myself. I was teaching at the University of Victoria, and I got shut down because somebody took offense at something where no offense was intended to be given. I think the issue really boils down to a tension within the student camp that actually wants, on the one hand, the latitudinarianism to be able to have a big tent approach that stands for everything and everyone, and on the other hand, to shut down any point of view that they think is intolerant of somebody stepping inside that tent. Now, what that tells me is that you have to have some basis for discriminating. Even by that consideration that you're going to shut people down, it's because you are discriminating on a certain basis. But you won't tolerate another person's point of view if it's different to yours, because that discriminating viewpoint is considered discrimination in a negative sense. That to me is a certain illogic. And I think that the way to actually resolve this issue is to try and understand what is, I think, happening. And I'm wondering if you will agree with this. I think what is happening is that we're losing a sense of verticality, losing a sense of objectivity, of recourse to first principles. What is in fact happening is a flattening of the world. And I think a university, if there's any place that ought to be standing up for verticality, standing up for objectivity and first principles, and teaching people how to think, I think that is the place where it ought to be happening. So I see this trend in society at large. I see it at universities, and it's particularly troubling. I wonder if you would agree with my analysis.
I would agree. I think that I couldn't help but think, as you were speaking, Mr. Lakhani, I think you're right that we've seen a rise of recourse to things like emotion and feeling and emotivism over first principles, whether it's just reason, logic, just these very basic evidence, facts, just very basic building blocks for having constructive discussion and critical thinking and whatnot. So the more that happens, that we have this rise of things like emotivism, emotion, feeling, doing the work, so to speak, of rational discourse. And I don't think that really becomes rational discourse, but if it's still being posited or purported to be rational discourse in a university setting, we're just kind of going nowhere. So I would agree with you. I can't put it any more eloquently than you did. I would agree, but I just couldn't help but think of that aspect of certain building blocks as first principles being supplanted by things that, or concepts or feelings or emotions that are not going to get us very far at all. And really, we were seeing this, I think, every day. Thankfully, I will say though, very quickly, I have in my very short time at UBC. I had a wonderful experience with my students at the law school. I imagine they know that my views on a few issues, I write op-eds now and then, maybe they Google me, I have no idea, but my experience, generally speaking, has been very positive. I get this sense that once you cut through all of those, the kind of the bramble that we were talking about, there is this desire of wanting to come to university to think critically, to learn, to reason, to logic, to do logic, to get an education. And I've been heartened by the fact that my students so far have been very willing to engage with me, and I've been very impressed with them, frankly.
Well, I will end our session now, and on behalf of all of you, I really want to thank Dr. Bird. He has opened up such important questions, and I think the length of our conversation here has demonstrated the way in which you've been able to attract our attention to them, and of course the huge range of areas that the topic of tolerance covers. So there's been something for everyone here. So thank you very much, and I hope we'll have more contact with you in the future. Bye-bye, everybody.
Much. A pleasure. Thank you, everyone. All the best.